Okay, well, hello everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started, I think. And so today is Wednesday, and I believe it's the 9th, and we'll go ahead and get started with the continuation of where we left off last time. We were talking about market structure theory, and we're going to continue our discussion today of perfect competition. So just to sort of bring you up to speed as to where we are today, we're going to cover, we just began really toward the end of the class session on Monday, talking about perfect competition. We're going to finish that discussion today, hopefully finish it, and then set the stage for moving into talking about monopoly, and then the two other remaining structures of this broader overall discussion of market structure theory. Okay, so that's where we are, and just to sort of back up here a little bit to talk about where we are. When we talk about market structure, we said that market structure is based upon the idea that there are four industrial structures that you could theoretically put any firm into. And I had indicated in class on Monday that yes, theoretically you could have a firm that might have sort of a linkage with government that makes it kind of difficult to sort of drop it into the category of being remember that early categorization of firms, that one of those three actor groups was for-profit and privately owned, and yet you've got some organizations like Sandia National Labs or Los Alamos National Labs, which are a little bit more difficult to categorize because of the fact that they are, sort of got a lot of governmental connections. But for the most part, those are a small minority of organizations. As far as private firms go, we can really put them into four structures, and they are, in order here, perfect competition, which we began talking about on Monday, and we'll try to get through this today. There's a lot to talk about here. And your text has got a lot of content, and some of it I think is a little bit technical, probably a bit more than what is necessary, but I'll try to boil it down in a format that I think is useful. So there's perfect competition, which we're going to say is sort of the North Pole, or the polar opposite of the second structure, which is monopoly. So if this is North Pole, this is South Pole, left, right, whatever sort of binary opposite you would like to know these as. In other words, when we talk about the characteristics of perfect competition, which we began to do on Monday, you can take practically any of the characteristics of perfect competition and flip them on their head, and you'll end up with the definition of monopoly. The only main difference is that all firms in all industries seek to maximize profit to the extent that they can, economic profit, remember. And the way that they do it is by, and we'll get to this a bit later, finding an output level at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Much more on that. We'll get to that here a bit later. Okay, so that's really the only thing that differentiates perfect competition from, or this is the only thing that sort of links perfect competition to monopoly, is the idea that all firms want to make money. And again, we come back to this sort of idea that all economic actors are engaged in what's called maximizing behavior. That is, they're trying to maximize the benefit from whatever it is that they're doing. So households in their roles as consumers, excuse me, are out to maximize utility and consumption. Firms are out to maximize profit, and governments are seeking to maximize the social welfare from the activities which they're involved in. Okay. So monopoly is the second category. The third category is something which, having sort of gone through that long spiel about the first two being opposite one another, we've, in the third category, got a hybrid of both. It sounds completely crazy because I've sort of laid these out as being North Pole, South Pole, and then we've got a hybrid of both of those. How can that be? How can you have a hybrid of two complete opposites? And we're going to talk about how that can be, and it usually has to do with time frame. And we talked quite a lot about on Monday about the idea of short run versus long run. That really is an important consideration. That was not just some afterthought left over from chapter 7 from the previous segment of the class. It really is an important differentiating factor in terms of behavior, in terms of expectations, in terms of profit. It really is a big differentiator. And then the fourth one here is something called oligopoly. Oligopoly is probably the strangest of all, but it's also very, very common. And we know oligopolistic industries when we see them because they're composed of very few firms supplying the bulk of the output. And it really is categorized by what we would really consider to be big business. Not that you can't have big business here or big business here, you probably would not hear, but you wouldn't all three of these. But oligopoly really is sort of the almost the walking, talking exemplar of the idea of big business. That is the idea of having limited competition and having being able to call the shots, doing what one pleases. One thing that's interesting about this is the fact that these last three together constitute are alike in the sense that they are not what the first one is. So I'm sorry for my coughing. I'm just trying to get over this cold and sort of hanging on with me. They would all be characterized as together falling into the category of what we would call imperfect competition. Excuse me, being categorized by what they are not. And what they are not is they are not perfectly competitive. And that is, there is something which prevents the dynamics of perfect competition from operating. And one of those characteristics is something called barriers to entry. And that was something that we got into a bit last time. That's where we're going to be jumping off today. That's the starting point for where we finish, where we lead off our discussion today. So imperfect competition means there's something that prevents the free flow of entry and exit into the market by rival firms or would-be rival firms. There is something that prevents the free flow of movement of prices and whatnot. And so we're going to talk about all of these. So anyway, perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, oligopoly. By the way, these were laid out in terms of chapter 8, chapter 9, and then chapter 10 together with these last two. For some reason, a lot of textbook authors link monopolistic competition and oligopoly in the same chapter. I don't really know why that is, because they are pretty different from one another. And I know that a lot of us who've been involved in reviews of editions of textbooks will say to authors. In fact, we were able to get one of the publishers to split up these two into two different chapters, because of the fact that a lot of us, and reviewers are basically just professors who look over copies before they're distributed to the public and make their comments, corrections, ideas, suggestions, that sort of thing. And we've long argued that these two should be separate, and in one case it did work as being successful, but could be in the interest of time, just putting them together. Also, the other thing, having been an instructor in this for a while, a lot of the things that we'll be talking about in perfect competition are sort of definitional items that relate to the language of market structure. This market structure being this overall topic, this overall sub field of microeconomics. And so we can sort of, if we talk about economic profit or whatnot, we can sort of move very quickly through the discussion of characteristics here with those two. So that would be a theory as to why that is the case. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything that we have talked about so far with regard to the short versus long run on Monday, or anything with regard yet to perfect competition. I know that we've got a few people on the live feed here, and so I can't hear you for whatever reason. And if you just try to talk to me, I know that this kind of came up a few days ago, and I do plan to get with the AV department to find out what they're going to try to do about that. Somebody, I think, had muted it on the computers themselves, so I have to kind of figure that out. I do have the live transcription on, so if that helps you, maybe that's good. But if you have a comment for me, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and I'll see it. It'll pop up right away, which is why I'm always looking over here, so that I can. It's off camera, but it's so that I can see what you're asking if you do have questions. Okay. All right. So we go back to the PowerPoint package that I had sent you on Monday, where we talked about perfect competition, after having listed those four categories of market structures. And we talked about perfect competition and the characteristics. And we talked about a number of things. Number one, we said there are many buyers and sellers available, and no individual seller has a very large market share. And when we talk about market share, it just sort of occurred to me that maybe we can define market share accurately or at all, really. But market share is simply this. It's probably a term that you have all heard before. It's usually expressed as a percentage. And it's simply this. It's the total revenue for the firm divided by the total revenue for the market. And by the way, something that I think is important to point out now, since we're going to be talking about this subject for a while here, is the idea of the term market and industry are going to be used interchangeably. This may be a little bit different than what we discussed with regard to market before, because I've said before that one of the interesting things about micro is that we can zoom in or zoom out when we talk about markets. That is, we can get very large of a grouping of markets by talking about the market for handbags in Albuquerque, and then zoom in on the market for handbags in Northwest Albuquerque, and then zoom in even further to a particular neighborhood in Albuquerque if we are that inclined, if it makes sense, if it's relevant to the market for handbags. And so you get the idea that if we want to sort of zoom in, zoom out, we can do that. When we talk about the industry, we're usually talking about whatever the relevant grouping of competing firms is, and it could be national. I mean, that's the same with market anyway. We could say it could be national, and certainly with perfect competition, the market is national. In fact, it's probably even global in many respects when we talk about the types of outputs that are produced in perfect competition. But what we're really saying here is the fact that, if you've got, something like, a commoditized item like corn or whatever, that sells into a sort of a global market. So in that regard, that would be an example. And I think I mentioned this on Monday, that agriculture sort of fits in perfectly as one of the key industries that we would use as an example of perfect competition. So anyway, market share is simply expressed as a percentage. It's the total revenue of a firm divided by the total revenue of the market itself. So which is pretty simple. So, if you have $50 of total revenue for a firm and $500 for the total revenue for an industry, then we could say that's 0.1, and simply multiply it by 100 then gives us 10%. So that we would say that firm has a 10% market share. Okay, meaning that they've got 1/10 of the market on the demand side. And so it's a very simple calculation. And what we're saying in perfect competition is that these market shares, these individual market shares that belong to any individual seller, are small, 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 small. And in fact, we're usually looking at something like less than 1%. So in this case, it's probably closer to 0.01 or 1.0%, that sort of thing. In fact, it may be even smaller than that. Because if you consider the examples of sellers who are competing in perfectly competitive markets, you're talking about lots and lots of, remember, that's the characteristic, lots and lots and lots of sellers. So in the market for something like grains or even something like petroleum, and I know that sounds completely crazy because we think of the oil industry, especially these days, as being, flush with cash and just, able to do what they want, just, walking tall. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just the opposite. A lot of them go out of business, particularly at the driller level, because of the fact that all they're doing is producing a commoditized product. Commoditized meaning it's also called fungible, which we hear a lot with regard to cryptocurrency. That is, one is the same as the other. That is, oil is basically oil. I know in the global market there are two different kinds of oil itself, but let's not muddy the waters there. But it's basically the same product. And because of that, they take whatever the market price is, and that's something we'll get to here in a second. So market shares are very small, that which belongs to any individual seller, and there's nothing really the seller can really do to impact that, okay? And sellers may relatively freely enter and exit the market. There are low, what we call barriers to entry. Okay, let's talk about this. This is the jumping off point for our discussion here, barriers to entry. So, which is why I think one of the reasons why it takes a bit longer to get through the perfect competition or whatever we decided to talk about first in this discussion of market structure, because we need to spend some time sort of laying out what these barriers to entry are. So what are barriers to entry? Barriers to entry are anything which would prevent new firms from entering a market on the supply side and competing to try to take their own market share, okay? To the extent that there are barriers to entry, firms can't get in, or it becomes difficult to get in. One of the characteristics that we talked about last time was high startup costs. And I think I left off the word cost as I was erasing this, I noticed that, but high startup costs. And that is, there are some industries that are just so difficult to get into that it really discourages competition. And one of those that comes to mind, and I think I mentioned it on Monday, was aerospace. It's just such a very complex business. Usually it's dominated by firms that already have existing patent protections. on products, and so you'd have to come up with your own engine and fuselage and computer system and all that. It would just be a nightmare to do. And that in fact, we've had more than one company that has created passenger aircraft. I'm talking about commercial air travel for airlines. Boeing is the big one in the US today, but Lockheed was also a competitor at one time. McDonnell Douglas was also a competitor. And for the most part, they're gone. They focus now mostly on defense products, whereas Boeing now does also defense, as national defense, military stuff, as well as the passenger market. And their competition worldwide is Airbus, which is not just private, it's also a sort of a consortium. That is, it's a grouping of investors together of European of origin, which have governmental backing. That's something that Boeing has long complained about, is the idea that they don't have government backing, but Airbus has. And so as a result, Airbus is one big competitor of Boeing. And it's interesting too, because this is an example of barriers to entry. There aren't many competitors. I think there's a Chinese complement, which that would only really apply if you fly on a Chinese airline or a Russian airline. Another example there, but that's pretty much it, I think, for the most part, in terms of aerospace companies. But it's interesting too, because I was on a layover once in an airport, and there was a pilot who was sort of waiting to catch his own flight, and I guess our pilot was late getting to our particular flight, and as he was coming in on a different flight and was going to move us somewhere else. And so somebody asked the guy sitting over there, who's a pilot for the same airline, "Hey, why don't you fly?" And he goes, "Oh, that's an Airbus. I don't even know how to fly an Airbus." So, you get the idea. These are different kinds of products that that have different sorts of it's a different product, different product altogether. And this leads us really then to the second issue, and that is sort of governmental protections. So product protections, which really take the form, and I think I put patents and copyrights last time. That would be an example. Something like patents. Patents are basically a legal monopoly to create whatever product, to produce whatever product you've got for a period of years. And I think those number of years were expanded for certain industries like pharmaceuticals a few years ago, in order to give them an exclusive right to market that particular good. Copyrights, which have to do with intellectual property, and also things of an entertainment and creative, sort of a creative product. Also, written works would fall into the category of copyrights. Copyright law is, my sister's a textbook editor, so she's very familiar with copyrights. And one of the things about copyrights, it begins to apply even if you haven't applied for a copyright, which is why occasionally you hear somebody say that, "Hey, I own the rights to this particular book because or movie script because I wrote it and somebody took it from me," or whatever. Then they've got to prove it somehow. But if you did write a movie script and somebody did take it from you, and you can prove that you wrote it, even if you didn't get a formal copyright from the government, you would have a legal claim to that particular work of creation. So, but you would probably be advised to go through some sort of copyright lawyer or a patent lawyer or whatever to go through it. So copyrights, patents, copyrights, also things like trademarks. Trademarks are interesting. We're going to talk a bit more about those when we get into monopolistic competition, because it really has to do a lot with branding. And we'll talk quite a lot about branding, what the value of a brand is, and why firms strive very strenuously to build and maintain the power of brands. And so it's really fairly important. So high startup costs are one example. That is, it becomes so difficult to get in that firms can't get there. Patent product protections are another. There could be some other legal barriers as well. Now, these sound like legal barriers, and I guess they probably could be at that point, but this would include things like licenses, that there are certain areas which you're trying to enter on the supply side, which you can't do unless you've got a license. This would apply to particularly to occupations. Keep in mind occupational, particularly professions, which require any kind of a license to operate. But you would be on the supply side of a market, whether you're a nurse or a doctor or an engineer or an accountant or a respiratory therapist or whatever requires a license. I don't know if that last one requires a license, but these are legal barriers you've got to get over. you can't practice as a tax preparer without a license. You can't practice as a cosmetologist without a license. These are legal barriers. Now, sometimes these barriers are not extremely high to get over, but sometimes they are. Okay, so becoming a medical doctor, for instance, one of the criticisms of our healthcare system, among many, and which we could do an entire semester on healthcare economics, but one of the criticisms has been that we don't have enough doctors in the United States. And so as a result, it's difficult to see doctors at times. And the ones we do see, sometimes they're not our regular doctor because our regular doctor is already filled up with his or her own patients or whatever. And one of the reasons for that is that there's been a self-imposed shortage for a long time, because to become a doctor, you have to go through an accredited medical school, which to get to medical school requires you to have very, very high grades as an undergraduate, yada, 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 pass the very high scores on the entrance exam, all that. So it's a burden. Not everybody can be a doctor, nor does anybody, nor do we really want everybody and their brother to be a physician. Like, do you want your next door neighbor, diagnosing your illness? I don't know that you do, maybe, certainly not my neighbor, but you kind of get the idea that licensing is a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing at all, but sometimes they serve as a barrier to what might be a more efficient system. If we had more physicians, maybe we would have a more efficient healthcare system. So anyway, that's just a thought, and you can sort of mull over that as you like. So legal barriers, which would be that. Also things like geographical restrictions. That is where you can sell your product. Some places will not allow firms to sell products in certain areas, or they'll designate where you can sell your product. I know that in the area that the line of work that I came from, finance, I was in banking for a number of years, and the state in which I operated, well, first of all, it's the law of the land nationally that you couldn't cross state lines as a bank. And then they would allow you to cross state lines with something called the EDGE Act, which was passed in the 1920s. It allowed you to put a loan office in some other location, but you couldn't accept deposits. So you could cross state lines that way. But in the state in which we worked, you couldn't branch across county lines, not state lines, county lines. You couldn't branch across county lines. And I worked in the first branch that was able to do that, mostly because our lawyers decided that because we were granted the specific right to do that by the feds, that it would trump state law. And as it turns out, the state didn't challenge that particular thing, but that would be a geographical restriction. And once we did it, sort of the floodgates were opened. And it wasn't me doing it. I was a very low-level officer at the time, but you kind of get the idea. So legal barriers would be one particular example of a barrier to entry. Let me see here if I've got some other ones. I don't know if I have a particular slide that is dedicated to this. Let me see if I do here or not. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. And my computer's gone to sleep. Bear with me here a second. Don't think I do actually. Okay, that's fine. So in terms of these barriers to entry, these would be any kind of things which would prevent. Also, things like things that sellers would throw up, and that would be such as barriers to distribution. Barriers to distribution. And when we talk about this, we're going to come next week to talk about two particular monopolies. And monopolies are defined as single sellers which dominate a market. And it's one firm that has a gigantic market share, usually considered above 90%. Now, I said single sellers, so you might be thinking, well, why isn't it 100%? Well, we're saying 90% is pretty much good enough to run the table and to, and sometimes these firms will not even worry about the small fry who constitute less than 10%, because they're at least 9 times bigger than the nearest competitor. And so it's not that big of a deal. Example would be something like Microsoft versus Apple back in the days in which those operating systems were competing. Apple today is a giant behemoth, but it's not so much in computers, really. It's more in devices, iPhones, iWatches, iPads, that sort of thing. That's really what made them the gigantic firm that they are today. Keep in mind, they were sort of a small subset of the computer ecosystem. They had their own operating system, their own hardware, and there were times in which people couldn't operate one machine or the other. And I admit that I did not know how to run a Macintosh for quite some time because I never worked on one. Okay, so when we talk about, so a barrier distribution here would be any kind of a lockout of how to get your product to the market. Now, the examples that we're going to talk about with monopoly are historical examples of, first of all, going back to the 1800s, that's the Standard Oil monopoly. Remember I said that monopolies are the complete opposite of perfect competition. And then we said that perfect competition experiences low barriers to entry. So we're talking about the high barriers to entry. So we're saying an absence of these in perfect competition. But just to explain what barriers to entry are, I'm just going to go through these now so we get this underway. So barriers to distribution would be, as an example, Standard Oil Company, which began around 1870. And it operated as what was called a trust. It's sort of a legal arrangement that was unique to its day because corporations could not cross state lines in those days. And, again, that was a geographical restriction. They got around by forming legal associations where they were essentially the same firm under the same management. And they basically said, okay, we're going to try to buy refiners. There's a long chain of value, production chain that goes into the oil business. That's from exploring and drilling to shipping through pipelines or by rail car to refining, that is basically cooking the oil to make gasoline and all kinds of other products from it, to basically marketing it at the retail and wholesale level. Standard Oil decided, hey, we're going to buy a bunch of refiners. That's the linchpin. It's the point of the market which they were going to dominate. And then anybody who wanted to refine oil could refine all the oil they wanted, but they couldn't ship it because they've got a lock on the railroads, which moved it. And when pipelines began to be invented, they got to control the pipelines too. So they said, sell out to us. It was basically a carrot and stick. Sell out to us. Here's the carrot. You're going to become rich because we're all making money hand over fist by controlling the quantity and the price of oil. But here's the stick. If you don't, you won't be able to ship your oil because we control railroads and we control the pipelines. And so there's nowhere to move it. This is a very similar example to Microsoft in the 1980s and into the 90s. The government alleged that Microsoft threatened hardware makers that they should not put other competing browsers on their machines, or they would retaliate by not allowing them to run their operating system and other software. And that was the allegation. It was eventually settled ultimately, and but I don't think there's any question about the fact that they pressured hardware makers to put on Microsoft products, because really the Internet Explorer browser was not dominant originally, but there were other, like Netscape was probably the original browser that really took off when the internet began. Microsoft saw an opportunity and jumped into it and sort of used that opportunity. And they made some specious arguments when it came down to it in the case, saying that the browser was integral to the entire computer system, integral to everything else that went along. And today you might think, well, maybe that's true, but in those days, probably not so much. So, but anyway, I don't want to get off the whole tall weeds here, but that would be an example of a barrier to entry, was this idea you can't move your product. Another example that I can recall was in the market which is like oligopolistic, that is few firms supplying the market, in the sort of the home goods superstore concept, that is Home Depot and Lowe's, some of these bigger retailers. And I know Lowe's had bought a company that made window blinds, and then once they bought it, they prevented that firm from selling those same blinds to Lowe's. Lowe's said, hey, that's not fair. We want to buy those because our customers want those blinds too. And Lowe's and Home Depot said, tough luck. We're not going to sell to you. So that would be a barrier to distribution. That is being locked out because of that particular sort of thing. There are other examples as well that we'll get to when we talk more about antitrust legislation, which is coming up in chapter 11. And I didn't put it on our listing of the schedule on the board, mostly because I'm not sure we're going to get to chapter 11 prior to the third exam, which is only coming up in 2 weeks. And so it's coming a little bit quicker now because I sort of stretched out the first 2 exams time-wise, just to kind of get people time to get registered and get going and get familiar with the course and all that. But now we're coming into it. We're speeding up a little bit here, but it won't be as many chapters per exam. But we may not get to chapter 11, which talks about an area of the law known as antitrust. And there's some other practices as well that would constitute barriers, but we'll get to those when we get there. Right now, those are not particularly important for us to talk about. The final one here that I want to talk about, which is a barrier to entry, even though it seems like it's something different, and that is barriers to exit. Barriers to exit. Now, a barrier to exit is also a barrier to entry, because a barrier to exit is anything which prevents a firm from leaving an industry. Now, this sounds like just the complete opposite. How could that be a barrier to entry if it's a barrier to exit? And it works like this. If you can't get out of an industry, then why do you want to get into it in the first place? So think about this. There is very often the case in strategic management, which for those of you going to business school, will probably take some sort of course in it, sometimes called policy, sometimes called strategic management, but it's an idea of what to do in terms of long-run planning for a company. And so sometimes firms will enter an industry or a market, and they'll decide that, hey, what do we do if it doesn't work out? How do we get out? And that's an important thing to talk about, because I don't know that, throughout a lot of the business courses that business students take, that there's enough discussion about how to manage failure and what to do when things don't go right, because sometimes things don't go right. Not every project works out, not every idea works out, certainly not every product makes it to becoming a successful home run winning product. And so how to get out is the big question. What if you can't get out? So a barrier to exit would be anything which would prevent you from leaving a market. So for instance, let's go back to the oil drilling business. If you are an oil driller and you want to drill in certain countries in the world, and you decide you no longer want to be there because of maybe you don't like the labor unrest that's there, or you don't like the local regulations or the taxes or the bribes you've got to pay to local officials, which, by the way, is illegal for US-based companies to pay bribes. There's something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It makes it very difficult for firms to do it, but yet that doesn't mean that they are not approached and pressured by local officials for bribes and shakedowns. It does happen. And so, but given that pressure of the fact that it's illegal to pay bribes to local officials, it could be that they say, we want to exit this market. We just don't like the conditions doing business here. We'll go somewhere else. And guess what? That local entity will seize the assets of that oil driller and say, you can't leave, we've got it, we own them now. And in fact, Egypt in the 1950s basically took over all foreign oil drilling in that country, and became very, very popular with the local population, not so popular with the international oil companies which were drilling there. And so you kind of get the idea that if you can't get out successfully, then you should not maybe get in the first place. If I go back to my example of the financial world in banking, sometimes banks don't want to enter particular markets because they don't feel like they could ever get out of them. I know that when I was in banking, we had lots of branches in areas that were really declining in terms of population, because maybe people there in that area were getting older, and so therefore were becoming less affluent. A lot of the younger people had moved out. A lot of the population there just was not exactly, they weren't really borrowers very much. They were older, retired. They weren't buying cars or fixing up their homes and whatnot. And so there was always consideration about, do we want to be in this particular market anymore? Because just given the fact that it's really no longer a very prosperous area, a lot of the people have moved out, and those who are there just really are not the ideal customer, whatever that is. And we were very often faced with the idea that we couldn't, because the government said you've got to serve all areas of the market, and so as a result you can't leave that particular market. So that's something to think about. Do you want to get into a market that you can't get out of for whatever particular reason? So you kind of get the idea. Barriers to exit serve as a barrier to entry. Think about hospitals. Hospitals, if somebody comes in and they've got a very, very serious emergency, they can't breathe or they're bleeding severely, well, they've got to be treated generally right away. And I don't think you can turn away somebody who's on the death's doorstep. They've got to be treated, whether they have insurance, whether they don't have insurance, which is why there's a lot of bad debt when it comes to hospital billing, is the fact that a lot of people don't have insurance. I think for hospitals, for-profit hospitals certainly would love to not treat patients who don't have insurance or any way to pay. but they really can't do it because there's just no way for them to do it. If somebody is bleeding to death, I think they pretty much have to be treated, whether they have a way to pay or not. So barriers to exit may, in their own right, serve as a barrier to exit, okay, or a barrier to entry. Okay. All right. So questions about any of that? Okay. So that's an example of barriers to entry. Also, because of the small market share, no single firm can influence the price of the product. The only thing they can really influence is their own particular output. In other words, P can't be controlled. That the only thing that can be controlled is Q, which makes them price takers. This is an important concept. The firms in this particular industry are considered price takers. That is, they can't do anything about the price of the good at all. Even if they try to ramp up production or dial down production, they can't do it. So if you think about this and say, well, wait a minute, what if all producers got together and said, okay, let's just agree to reduce output so that we raise the price of the particular product? Well, okay, great idea, I guess. First of all, it's illegal for producers to get together to agree on limiting output. But even if they were able to do it, you're talking about an industry with potentially thousands of competitors. How are you going to arrange that particular deal whereby they all decide to limit production? That is, to shift supply this way. If you shift supply to the left, what happens to the price? On the price axis, the price is going to go up, right? We know that if there's a restriction in supply and the demand is unchanged, then there's going to be a rise in the price of that particular good. So can thousands of producers get together and do it? Well, I don't think the evidence is very good that they can. And I'll just give you one bit of evidence to support that contention, and that is the Opec Oil Cartel, which is only about, 24 countries in the world that are mostly state-owned oil companies around the world that have formed a cartel. A cartel is defined as a group of cooperating producers. Okay, and Saudi Arabia is one of the key drivers of that. Russia is also a member of that, sort of the extended group of what's called OPEC Plus, which includes Russia. Russia's, I don't believe, a formal member of that organization. It's been around for quite some time, several decades. And OPEC cartel formation is illegal in the U.S. It's illegal in Europe, but U.S. and European law does not extend to other countries that decide that they want to engage in cartel formation. So the OPEC Oil Cartel has been around for a very long time. So you're only talking about a couple dozen members. And even within that, they can't always get it together in terms of controlling the output, that is to cut output to drive the price up because of cheating. That because as the price goes up, somebody somewhere decides, hey, let's just open the spigot, take advantage of this, earn the cash while we can. But in so doing, shifts the supply curve back the other direction. So maybe they gain in the very short run at the expense of the larger group. So the inability to coordinate among producers is one of the reasons why that can't happen, particularly in the case of perfect competition. There's just too many competitors there, and with an inability really to get it together. It would just be inconceivable. If 24 producers can't get it together, how can thousands of them get together? And what forum are they going to use to get? Are they all going to get together in the Superdome for a meeting? That would be pretty obvious, wouldn't it? Particularly since it's an open conspiracy. That wouldn't be what kind of a conspiracy is open, right? That doesn't make any sense. So you get the idea. It just doesn't make any sense. They take the price that's given. It doesn't matter what they produce. They produce more. They produce less. The price is going to be unchanged. Which doesn't mean the price doesn't change, because it does, and that's one of the characteristics. But it changes because of demand and supply factors in the broader market. I'm going to be getting to that here shortly. So whatever the price is market determined, but not individually producer determined. And that's really what distinguishes, in a very big way, perfect competition from the other three categories of imperfect competition. So we say also I'm just sort of going down the list here in our PowerPoint package. We say the products are standardized or commoditized. I think I've alluded to this previously. The idea is that these goods are pretty much the same, that if you're producing agricultural output, that is a perfect example of any particular firm or any particular producer that produces basically the same good. The corn is basically corn. Do you really care where it came from, whether it came from Iowa or Illinois or Kansas? You really don't. Does it even cross your mind? Probably not. I'm sure it doesn't. It doesn't cross mine. I know that Idaho has had has long touted its potatoes, but I don't know that I've ever seen a whole lot of advertising in the store that says these potatoes are Idaho potatoes and therefore I should buy them. I don't know that really works. Maybe they think it works. I don't really know. But these goods are pretty much the same as all other goods. And we're talking about any kind of a commoditized output where a commodity is simply any good which can't be differentiated from the same goods in the same category. Fish is basically fish. Meat is meat. Milk is milk. Eggs are eggs. Vegetables are vegetables. And so as a result, there's no real differentiation. And so as a result, these goods are commoditized, and as they are standardized. There's no real ability to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that there haven't been efforts, and sometimes some successful efforts, to try to get consumers to believe that there is a difference. And with some degree of success, particularly at the retail level, that is, there are some vegetables that have got branding like Del Monte and Libby and Van Camp, where these are, and I'm sure there are others as well, like Fresh Life, that have been around for a long time, Bird's Eye, but they've been around for such a long time that people know them, and that in that regard, they just simply act like automatons when they buy them. But these are packaged goods. These are not the goods that are come in the bin. You don't see Bird's Eye as a symbol on goods which are in some sort of bin, like potatoes and tomatoes and peppers that you pull out of the bin there. You really don't. It really doesn't matter what you're doing there. These are packaged goods, and packaged goods themselves can have a bit of branding. And we're going to talk a bit about that. Excuse me. Excuse me. When it comes to monopolistic competition, because that particular structure is all about branding, and we'll get to that here shortly. I apologize for my coughing here. I probably should have taken some cough medicine before I left the house today. So we know that those packaged goods do have some ability to command a bit of a higher price than the generic counterparts, which are the same goods basically. But at the wholesale level, the producer level, it's all corn, it's all oats, it's all soybeans, it's all the same thing. There's no real differentiation as a result. Those goods are what those goods are. Now, can scientists tell whether a potato came from South Dakota or Idaho? Yeah, maybe, probably. Is any buyer really worried about that? I think the answer to that is probably no. Okay. All right. And one big characteristic here is that price equals marginal revenue. In other words, the demand curve is assumed to be perfectly elastic. Okay. So now let's get into some of the graphing on this. And this is really an important issue here, is that we are talking about a situation that looks like this. When we talk about perfect competition, this is the only structure that we're going to be looking at a split screen view of the situation. That is, that which affects the market and that which affects the firm. And we're going to say whatever affects the market affects the firm, because the firm is essentially along for the ride. And by the way, an individual farmer would be considered a firm, right? So we've got the firm level here, and we've got the market level here. Market being the bigger thing, and the firm being the smaller thing. So you've got a supply curve with something like that, and we won't really worry about supply over here so much. And we've got a demand curve that looks something like that. Okay, and we've got an equilibrium price and quantity. So equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, and by now, hopefully these are now familiar to everybody, that this PQ plane. Okay, nothing new there, I don't believe, right? So what you've got going on is you've got the price that's determined by the interactions of demand and supply. So this is basically introductory econ from the second or third week, right? In our case, from chapter 3 in the text, which talks about the intersection of demand and supply forming the price of the good. And so we're saying the price is market determined. So if the price is market determined, then that price is going to be whatever that price is going to be, and it's going to be the same price at any particular output level. So here we're going to do the methodology we're going to use here is this idea. We're going to use the small letters to represent something that is smaller, and the capital letters to represent something which is bigger. So small p, small q, small d here. And what we're saying about the situation here with, I guess maybe I could have this as a green keep the demand curve green here, is that we're saying that it doesn't matter what the output level is, the price is going to be what the price is going to be because the seller can't do anything about it. So whether the quantity is here, doesn't make any difference. The output decisions of the individual firm don't impact the market price at all because these very small market shares prevent that firm from making any kind of movement, from having any kind of influence in the market that would affect the price. And so the price is what the price is, which is why we call these particular producers price takers. It doesn't make any difference what happens with that particular situation, okay? And then if something happens where, let's say, demand for the good is rising, and so now we have D goes from D1 now to D2, so there's an increase in overall demand for whatever reason. Maybe the price of the substitute has gone up, and so as a result, people now buy this good more. Maybe this is the market for corn, and the price of green beans has gone up, and so people say, whoa, we don't want to buy green beans, we would now rather buy corn. And so as a result, because now they want to buy more corn, Q goes from Q1 to Q2. So this is the market for corn. Let's just say market for corn here, right? And the price of green beans has gone up. Firm, this would be an individual corn producer, right? Individual corn producer. So a farmer, but when we talk about farmers, it's a little bit difficult because I think we think of some individual person who's a farmer where it could actually be a farm corporation. That's more of the trend. It's really where agriculture is going. It's becoming bigger business. And whether it ever gets to be big business like oligopoly is doubtful. Certainly, I think in my lifetime, probably in everyone's lifetime here. I don't think we're that close, particularly in a gigantic economy like ours. But nonetheless, the point is that that the individual firms right now would be considered individual producers, price takers. So in this case, the price of green beans has gone up. So now the demand side wants more corn. And so as a result, they're going to bid up the price of corn because there's more corn that's being demanded. So as a result, what do we have here now? We have a new demand curve, which, by the way, the individual producer is along for the ride. The individual producer had nothing to do with this, right? And so there's basically a shift in demand for that particular product and an uptick in the price from some P1 to some P2 that this particular seller had nothing to do with. But they're along for the ride. They're the beneficiaries of a rise in the demand for that particular good. And so as a result, they are in a good shape because they get a higher price, regardless of how much they produce. And in fact, as the price is going up, we know that any kind of producer would be along for the ride. Now, by the way, the supply curve here, I haven't brought in the supply curve on the market side yet because right now I'm focusing mostly on the demand curve and what the implications are of the particular demand curve here, okay? Okay, so you kind of get the idea as to what's going on here. Likewise, if the demand curve were to shift left, then we would have a similar kind of situation where, so now we have a leftward shift to demand, meaning that maybe now the price of green beans has fallen below that of a comparable quantity of corn. And so now quantity is now fallen back. And so now we have a decrease in the price from P1 to P3. So now we have a leftward shift. Now we have a new price, P3, P3. And I guess I got to keep my colors straight here. This would be a demand curve of D3. Here, the individual producer had nothing to do with it. It's not that person's fault, that producer's fault, but it did happen. And so as a result, they take the lower price. As a result, that should be D3 here. They take the lower price because they have no choice if they want to stay in the market. Now, by the way, when we talk about a lot of farming operations, there are barriers to exit with regard to this, which is one explanation for why these difficulties with individual farmers have persisted for quite some time. It's because of the fact that it's very difficult to sort of get out. This is an industry that once you're in, you're pretty much in, you really can't get out of. They've got lots of equipment that's financed and they've got to service the debt on that. There's lots of land that they own. I come from a farm family, and so I'm familiar with these issues, that there are taxes that have to be paid every year on the real estate. And so as a result, they've got to keep operating and doing something. And by the way, even if a good is particularly in demand and is got a high price, it doesn't mean it is the next year. And also those crops have got to be rotated. You can't plant the same thing on the same land year after year after year because you will wear out the land. So you've got to do some other kind of crop. Maybe rotate corn and soybeans, for instance, is one thing that is often done. Okay. Now the same could be said for any kind of a supply shift. That if in fact you've got a supply shift to the left for whatever reason, and that's going to, so a restriction in supply, that's going to drive the price up. And that's oftentimes what cooperative groups of producers will try to do, is to try to force the price of the good up by restricting the supply. As a result, they all benefit from that particular issue. Okay, so they ride along with that, and so that's in that respect is considered to be a pretty good thing. Okay, now the other aspect of this is the idea of marginal revenue. So let's talk about marginal revenue real briefly here, and talk about what that is. So just to review here, marginal revenue is incremental revenue, right? It's incremental revenue. That is, what do we earn for producing the next unit, or the next 10 units, or the next 1,000 units, or whatever sort of increment we would like to talk about here. So it's incremental revenue, and it's simply defined as the change in total revenue divided by the change in total product, or Q, right? And in this case, if we want to say the change in total Q, we can't. That's fine, because we are bringing the demand side in here, so it's perfectly fine now to talk about Q, because we're going to make the assumption that all the output that is produced is sold. So in other words, it's got exchange value and it is exchanged in the market. So now total product, we're saying there's nothing that's unsold. So total product here is really analogous to Q. And so let's just go with Q once again. And in so doing, I don't know that it really impairs our ability to, to grasp these concepts, because they really are the similar things that we're talking about here. Okay, so marginal revenue is incremental revenue. So let's take an example here of what happens if we've got the price of a particular good. Okay, and let's say that we've got the price of a good is $5. Okay, and the quantity of the good is going to vary. And remember, total revenue is price times quantity, right? So price times quantity is total revenue, right? And then we would want to compute marginal revenue, which is this formula here. So if the price of a good is $5, and we're saying it's $5, let's say it's $5, P1 is 5, let's say, okay? And it's $5 all the way across. So it's 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. And let's say we produce 10 units of output and 25 units and 40 and say 50, okay? I'm just sort of making numbers up here, but hopefully the math should be relatively easy. Hopefully I don't have to run to my calculator here to help us. So again, total revenue is a dollar figure, which is price times quantity. And so hopefully the math is straightforward. 5 times 10 is 50. 5 times 25 is 125. 5 times 200 is, 5 times 40 is 200. See me even thinking ahead here. 5 times 50 is 250. Okay. All right. So marginal revenue is what here? So remember, marginal revenue is that incremental step as we go from one level to the next here. And let me see if I can maybe swivel the camera just a bit here to capture some of my work. If I'm able to there. Hopefully that's, if I can zoom a little bit. That should be satisfactory for now. So, and I'll bring it back to the bigger screen here in a minute. So what is change in total revenue? So change in total revenue is, it's really, remember, it's new minus old, right? So it's 125 minus 50 over 25 minus 10. 125 minus 50 is 75. 25 minus 10 is 15. 75 minus divided by 15 is 5. So marginal revenue is 5. As we go from 10 to 25 units of output, marginal revenue is 5. Okay. What about when we go from between 25 and 40 units of output, where now the change in total revenue is the difference between 200 and 125. That's the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity, which is 40 minus 25. And so what do we have now? We have 200 minus 125 is 75. Divided by 40 minus 25 is 15. Well, that's the same formula. 75 divided by 15 is 5. Maybe you can see where we're going here. And then between 40 and 50 units of output, we have the change in total revenue is 250 minus 200. So it goes from 200 to 250, and 50 minus 40, which is the change in quantity. So we have 50 over 10, which again is 5. And so what do we have here? We have price equal to marginal revenue. Now, what may be obvious here is the idea that, well, of course, marginal revenue is 5. What else would it be but 5? Because the fact that all you're doing is producing more goods at the same price, why wouldn't it be 5? Well, here's why it wouldn't be 5. It's because the fact that if you've got a firm that's got any kind of price making ability, and we haven't really talked about these structures yet, like a monopoly or like an oligopoly or whatever, they can alter the price of the good through their actions, producing more or producing less. In perfect competition, remember, one of the characteristics is that these firms can't do it. They can produce all they want. But by the way, and if they try to charge any more than that, what happens? So let's say that a particular seller grinds his feet and says, I'm going to take $6. That's all I'm going to get. Well, $6 does what? It goes all the way, the quantity goes all the way to 0. There is no value of demand at $6 for that particular product if it's selling at 5. No seller is going to pay more for that particular product because why are they going to pay 6 when they get the same thing for 5? It doesn't make any difference, right? And in the business world, there's no such thing as friends, right? I mean, I guess that's maybe putting it a little bit harshly, but why would I want to pay you 6 when I can buy it for 5 when it's the very same product? And so as a result, price equals marginal revenue. So, but it's price will always equal marginal revenue, whether the price is 5 or whether the price is 10 or whether the price is 2. It doesn't make any difference. Now, in this case, it just happens to be that the price is 5, and so the marginal revenue is 5 all the way across. And so what can we say then again about the demand curve in this particular case? One thing that we can say about the demand curve for the firm in perfect competition is this: that demand and marginal revenue are essentially one and the same. So if we go back to the original P1 here, and let's just go with the original P1, and P1 is 5, that we say the demand curve is the marginal revenue curve. So demand and marginal revenue are one and the same. There's no difference here. And it sounds, in other words, the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve are one and the same. This is going to be very important as we progress here. Excuse me, because when we talk about this idea of how we maximize profit, marginal revenue becomes a really important consideration. And it's a little bit unique in perfect competition because it is this one structure that has these particularly unique characteristics whereby they can't control the price of the product no matter what they do, despite all their best efforts at trying to differentiate the product. It oftentimes doesn't work, even at the retail level. Now, I talked about the fact that some have success at the retail level, whether it's something like Libby's or Green Giant or Del Monte or whatever. Some limited success. They do command some pricing power because some buyers are responsive to that. But that's only in the packaged goods industry. In the wholesale business, there's really no differentiation whatsoever in terms of that. And in fact, even for some packaged goods at the retail level, it's difficult to differentiate. And we know this. I know that when I was in graduate school, I had a professor who did a study on the attempts to differentiate oil, motor oil that you'd buy like on the shelf at Walmart or AutoZone or wherever. And there was a big effort on the part of Quaker State back in the 1980s to try to make themselves look so much better than others. And so Quaker State, the best oil, and they just really couldn't get it going. It was a huge amount of expenditure on marketing. And it turns out they just couldn't differentiate their brand enough. It doesn't stop firms from advertising. Valvoline advertises, Quaker State still advertises, Pennzoil advertises, but they just want to keep the brand out there because there are some devotees to particular brands, but it's a very weakly branded product. Motor oil does not have particularly strong branding usually. Now, I know in the racing world, I've got a cousin who's involved in drag racing. He swears that drag racers prefer Valvoline. Motor oil, I don't know if that's the case or not. I think Lucas Oil is another one that they swear to. That's a pretty small market, I would think. And how many people do you know or in drag racing as a business. So that's a very small ecosystem. So for the most part, these brands are difficult to, or these brands are difficult to get people to pay up for because it becomes a lot about price. So, which is why the prices are relatively the same. And sometimes for goods that are pretty much identical, they do sell for the same price because it's difficult to differentiate one from the other. So the demand curve is the same as the marginal revenue curve. By the way, look, it's perfectly flat. Meaning what? It is perfectly elastic. Now, remember what we said back in chapter 5 when we talked about elasticity, that is the elasticity of demand. We said that there are polar cases of demand curves where you've got some that are perfectly vertical, that is perfectly inelastic, where buyers are completely insensitive to the price. They'll buy the same quantity whether the price is here. Doesn't make any difference. They'll pay whatever price. And then there are cases of perfect elasticity where if the price goes up a little bit, there is no demand whatsoever. There's no quantity demanded at that particular price. So buyers are perfectly sensitive to the price of the good, particularly at the producer level where the goods are all the same and it's market determined and everybody takes the same price, that there is no particular difference. By the way, the stock market could be considered an example of this as well. I mean, you pretty much are a price taker when you're buying stocks. It's because the stock of any company, whatever it is, Alcoa, just to pick a company out of the hat here, right? The price is what the price is. And yes, you can put a bid in for a different price and maybe it gets accepted. It's not going to be hugely different. You're going to pay pretty close to what the market price is. And that's really what we're getting at here, is the price is going to be pretty close to 5. It's going to be maybe differ a little bit up and down just a bit, because when it comes to markets, particularly auction markets, like the stock market, like the grain market, there are some small price differences, but they will hover around sort of an equilibrium price. And we're going to make the assumption that this particular P, this P star, is in fact an equilibrium price. It is the agreed upon selling value, and it is short term. It will change. One of the things we know for sure is that the price is going to change. I can't think of too many goods in which the price is the same and has never changed. It really doesn't exist. And what's really interesting is that occasionally you'll see some old Coke machines from like, I don't know, the 30s or 40s or whatever, and they'll have the price of the good 5 cents sort of as part of the machine itself. It'll be like part of the metal molding of the machine. And obviously 5 cents is no longer a viable price for 1 unit of Coca-Cola or whatever. And so it's sort of there as sort of a, but that would be antique, and I don't think anybody would buy Coke out of one of those machines today anyway. But you get the idea. Nobody is going to do that today because of the recognition that prices will change. And you really can't hang your hat on a particular price. And firms that do advertise price don't do it for very long, and because the price will change. In fact, even I've been waiting for this day to happen. Even Dollar Tree, which my wife loves to go to, no longer really advertises everything for $1. We're in inflationary times now, so they really can't sell a lot of their goods for $1. Now they got away with it for quite some time by shrinking the size of toothpaste and wrapping paper and whatever else that came to them, usually made by anonymous foreign producers. But now they've decided that they've given up the ghost and they are now saying not everything is $1, but it's pretty close. And it's going to be cheaper than what you can buy elsewhere. And so it is a pretty good deal to go to Dollar Tree, because there is a lot of stuff that you can get there, particularly things that, just are cheap things that, like a spatula. I would go there to buy spatulas for the grill because they're, close to $1, and why pay more for something that's pretty mindless like that. Okay. All right, let's finish up these characteristics here, and then we'll probably end up by talking about economic profit next time, and then we'll give. And we've already talked about some of the examples of these industries, and so that'll be all we have to wrap up on Monday when we talk about then lead into monopoly. But we're saying the market is intensely competitive, so much so that there's really no ability to compete on quality. The product is what the product is. These are commoditized products. We're saying that economic profit is possible in the short run, but we're saying that economic profit in the long run is 0. And the reason it's 0 are, and I'll give you the graphics next time. I don't really have the time to do that today, But we're saying that the market dynamics of this, in a market in which there's any kind of economic profit that's being earned, it'll be very obvious. I mean, these are not, this is not markets in which people are operating behind the scenes in shadowy, closeted areas. People can see what's going on in particular markets in which there are high prices that are being earned and hence high economic profits. People want in on that. They want to go after that. And as a result, the price will come down. As the price comes down, it brings the profitability down to the point where actually profits can become negative for everybody. And then people leave the market. And as they leave the market, the price comes back up and it goes on and on and on. And if you want an example of this, just look at oil production. We have seen this again and again and again and again. Right now, the price of oil is high, mostly because of international fears, international tensions. The rest of the world is sort of punishing Russia for its military operations in Ukraine, with the exception, I guess, of China. So they're trying to shut off, and I know the president yesterday announced that they were going to no longer accept Russian oil and natural gas. Well, now those are supply issues where people really don't know what is going to happen with the supply of oil. But what's going to happen, I can tell you, is this. Now, we've got lots and lots of domestic production. It isn't just in the US, but we certainly have it here. People are going to now, firms that is, are going to decide to produce oil, because at $125 a barrel, that is hugely profitable. And to the extent that they've already got oil leases, that is the right to drill, the mineral rights to drill, they can, within a fairly short time, within a couple of months or so, get active and start drilling for oil again. As oil enters the market, it will bring the price down. So yes, we're paying $4.19 a gallon for gasoline. I think that was the price I saw yesterday. I told everybody that I bought gas on Sunday night. I think I told the class Monday I bought gas on Sunday night after seeing what the futures market was going to be for oil. But I can't store it in my swimming pool. I can only put it in my tank. And so as a result, at some point I'm going to need gas again, and I'll be paying the market price. So we too are price takers when we can't choose a substitute. Okay, but it will come down again. I mean, it will come down. And if you think it's never going to come down again, then that's probably a misreading of how the supply function works. Okay, so what else do we want to say about this? So it's possible in the short run, and it's possible it's due to economic luck. So I mean, what could be luckier? And I hate to say this because I know that one of the reasons why the big pop-up oil was, first of all, oil was already going up even months and months ahead of time because the global demand was growing post-pandemic. I mean, the world started coming out of the pandemic. And so as a result, people were demanding more oil, more goods were moving. So the oil price was already going up. So if you're a driller now, it's economic luck. Now it sounds pretty, I don't know, maybe rude to say, but I guess the misery of some people is the benefit to others. So as a result, it's bad for Ukraine, clearly, no question. But it might be good for drillers who want to get on this and drill more oil. Now, there are noises that's coming out of the government about going after firms that are trying to profiteer and gouge the public. Economists don't believe there is any such thing as gouging, really, I think, for the most part, because it is what it is. Market price is the market price. And by the way, if you're an oil driller, you could say, look, nobody felt sorry for us when the price was $25 a barrel. Now it's $125 a barrel, and now everybody's pointing the finger at us like we had something to do with it. But nobody felt any kind of sympathy for us at all when we had to close down, shut down operations, lay off workers, send them home when the price was $25. That's a pretty good argument, isn't it? I mean, how do you really argue with that? Even though I know the press doesn't care about that particular argument, and they will go on and on about price gouging, but it's market determined. And if you're a seller, why not participate in that? Because, by the way, you are helping to actually bring down the market price of oil if you are producing more. So that is going to happen at some point. So economic profit, we're saying, is zero in the long run. That is, the price equals marginal revenue equals average total cost. And by the way, when we talk about economic profit, right, profit in general is simply the difference between total revenue and total cost. We have talked about that before, right? So when we talk about price per unit, then the profit per unit in the long run is simply this: it's price minus average total cost, right? And if price is equal to average to marginal revenue, then price is equal to marginal to if price is equal to marginal revenue, then if profit per unit is 0, then price equals marginal revenue, which equals average total cost, all of which equal 0 in terms of profit. Actually, that's not right. Price minus average total cost is 0. Price minus average total cost is 0. Price or marginal revenue, one and the same, right? So this is per unit and $0 per unit. So total revenue minus total cost is 0 at 0 profit. Price minus average total cost is 0. That is, there's no difference between the price of the good or the marginal revenue of the good in this case, minus the average total cost, which is the unit cost. Remember, ATC is the unit cost at that particular level of Q, whatever Q is. So as a result, it is, excuse me, I'm sorry, considered to be 0 in the long run. Economic profit, remember, because when we're factoring in the relevant opportunity costs or the implicit costs which are involved in that particular case. And then the last thing we'll talk about is the profit maximizing output is the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that is a really good stopping point for where we're going to go next time. And in fact, it is the common thread that ties all of these 4 structures together is the fact that they all share that particular characteristic, that maximizing profit, as difficult as it is, and as 0 economic profit producing as it is in the long run, nonetheless could be positive accounting profit. So there's positive cash flow and all that good stuff, right? But even though it's 0, that's still above negative, right? So and all firms are looking to maximize profit, and they do it by finding the output level at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So are there questions for me about anything that I've talked about today so far? Okay, well, if you do have questions, feel free to contact me. I'm generally available. And I should be around over the weekend as well. So everybody have a good weekend, and I'll see you next time.